drought conditions are forcing you to make sales on your farm or ranch, you may be able to defer that income. Tina Barrett from Nebraska Farm Business spoke with us this week about options producers might have.
We're certainly going to have crop producers that are affected by the drought, but that's a little bit different because we've got crop insurance that's going to handle that and be no different than what we've dealt with, whether it's a hail loss or a wind loss or a drought loss. So if we've got crop insurance, we do have the option to defer that 1 year. Just a couple of things to be careful with that is it's an all or none election. So, all of your crops have to be deferred. And if you did get crop insurance for like your 2011 crop in January of this year, you can't defer that another year. So it was just, you can only get 1 year's deferral out of it. So
when it comes to livestock, what are the options that you have for deferring livestock to the next year?
Right, so livestock comes into a little different. And this time we have to prove there's a drought. And where the governor asked for 55 counties to be declared disaster areas last week, we have an opening for that. So those counties and anyone around them have an automatic approval for this drought laws. So with the livestock deferrals, we have a 1 year deferral that allows us to defer any livestock sales that are excess of your normal sales to the following year. And it's, as with most tax law things, it's a little complicated in how it's calculated. But if you end up selling 2 calf crops in 1 year, we can get some of that income deferred to the following year and kind of even things back out for you.
And like you mentioned in crops, it's all or nothing here as well?
It is. It's a calculation. You have to prove how much excess calf sales you would have had in that year. So it's a 3-year average, and you figure out how many normally you would have sold, and that's the amount that you can defer.
Just to step back to the definition of drought, there's a possibility that more counties could be declared a drought.
Certainly. Anytime we say this, a lot of times there's an initial chunk, and then there's other counties that get added on. So if the drought continues, we might see that if your county's not in it now, it might be by the end of the year. And even if you sold them now, before your county was declared a disaster, you'd still qualify.
You mentioned the 1 year deferral for the livestock scenario. What about the 4-year deferral?
Right, there is a 4-year deferral, and this used to be 2 years, and with the extended drought we had in the early 2000s, they made it a 4-year deferral. So we have 4 years to replace breeding livestock. It's draft dairy and breeding livestock. So your calf crop this time wouldn't qualify for that, but any breeding livestock that you had to sell in excess of what you would normally cull is allowed to have that deferral of income. And you can have up to 4 years to replace it. And so it takes that gain and reduces your basis in the new ones that you bought. And so, it allows us to have a little bit more time.
Essentially a buffer to rebuild the herd.
It is. And if we go way out in the future and we think about this drought that continues 5 years, they can extend that 1 year at a time. So if the drought continues, you have until 1 year at the end of the drought to replace those livestock.
Now, is it always best to take the deferral to next year, or do you maybe not want to take it at all?
Sometimes there's a lot of things that we need to think about. It's always good, everyone wants to defer tax, but there's some things to think about. Like in 2012 is our last year where breeding livestock is going to be eligible for the 0% capital gains rate. If you're in a lower income tax bracket and they're raised animals, there's no sense in deferring a 0% tax and offsetting something that you could get a deduction for in the future. And that you might be in a low income because of the drought, so you might be better off to go ahead and recognize that gain at those low brackets now, offset some higher income in the future.
Sort of take the punch later.
Exactly. There's different ways to doing that. You also get, if you think about the sale of breeding livestock as ordinary income, not subject to self-employment taxes, but the depreciation from the new animals that you'd buy would offset both ordinary and self-employment taxes. So you could end up getting a bigger deduction for your money in the future than what you're potentially deferring today. So there's some things that everybody needs to kind of take a step back and see if it's maybe better to work that into this year's planning.
Tina says because each producer's situation is different, she recommends each person talks to his or her own tax preparer.